Howdy HRD 491 students. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to qualitative research and to actually look at a published qualitative research article. The article that you see is available for you online, and we'll get to that in just a few moments. Before we begin, though, I do want to talk a little bit about qualitative research. And so if you've read the chapter already, some of this will be a bit of a review for you. But the main thing that I want to start talking about is the fact that the main difference between qualitative and quantitative research is the type of data. And so we can very easily see by the article that you see on the screen that if you just picked up this journal article without really reading anything about it, it would look very much like a quantitative article. If you do read the title, obviously it says a qualitative study, so that gives you a hint that in fact it is a qualitative study. And then certainly when you got into the methodology and the results, you would see that the data is a little bit different, meaning that it is a qualitative research article. But if you just look at it on from the face value, if you will, you'll see that it just looks like any other article that we might have read up to this point in the term. Now, a couple of things that make qualitative research different from quantitative research, other than the fact that the data is different, is that qualitative research does typically take place in the field. So other names for it are things like naturalistic inquiry, participant observation, and we'll be talking about some types of qualitative research in just a few minutes. Qualitative research is no less scientific when it's done correctly compared to quantitative methods. They're just different. Another thing, qualitative research assumes that there are multiple realities that the participants have or have their multiple perspectives of the participants, which is very different from quantitative research. Quantitative research assumes that there is a single objective reality and that can be measured. So one of the things that's really important in qualitative research is the context. And so again, that goes back to it typically does happen in natural settings as opposed to maybe classrooms from a quantitative perspective, labs from a quantitative perspective. If we were talking about employees, instead of seeing them in their natural setting, we might bring them into a classroom and measure something like a paper and pencil measurement. You guys used employees and you were looking at their communication skills. You didn't really look at their communication skills in their natural setting per se, but you know, if you had a large group of them, you probably would bring them into a large room and test them. So from a qualitative perspective, we would go out to where they are in the field. So whether it be a restaurant, a department store, a manager at a bank, we would go look at them in that setting. A couple other things that are important are different in qualitative research. Again, your words are your data. And so qualitative research depends on there being rich narrative descriptions of what is being observed, the interview process, or if you're actually looking at documents. So again, very much different from quantitative methodology. Qualitative research also is considered to be process-oriented, meaning that it looks at the process of going from point A to point B, where quantitative just looks at the outcome, not the process of getting there. So it's more quantitative is more product oriented. In terms of the different, let me say one more other thing about differences. Another thing that is different about qualitative research is it does use an emergent research design. So that's very different from quantitative research. In quantitative research, if we were going to do a training program, we would say we're going to train people for 6 weeks, 3 days a week, an hour at a time. And at the end of that 6 weeks, 3 days a week, hour at a time, we're going to measure X, Y, or Z. From a qualitative perspective, the researcher never goes into the research process thinking, I'm going to observe for 6 weeks, or I'm going to observe for 2 weeks, or I'm going to observe for 6 months. The data collection in qualitative research continues until no further information is gained or gleaned from the process. So again, very different from quantitative perspective. In terms of the types of qualitative studies, the three that I'm going to mention are ethnographies, case studies, and phenomenological studies. Ethnographies, if you can think of one word that would be as synonymous, I guess, with ethnography, it would be culture. So ethnographies look at the culture or the patterns and the social groups within, in our case, for the most part in HRD and technology management, it would be within an organization. So what's the culture within the organization? A lot of the anthropological studies are ethnographies. So if you've ever heard of Gorillas in the Mist, where someone goes out and studies, in that case, the hierarchy within a pod of gorillas. So that wouldn't be necessarily something we would study, but just to give you an example. Another type is a case study. Case studies, the term that you can kind of attach to that is that it is a bounded system. So there are a lot of case studies of organizations, groups within organizations. We could do a case study of freshman females within the Corps of Cadets, and so that's very bounded because we're looking at a very narrow group and focusing on a very narrow group of subjects. And then lastly, another one is a phenomenological study. What you're trying to look at there is the essence of an experience. Some interesting information about a phenomenological study are things like people would suggest that unless you have experienced whatever it is that is being studied, that you might not be the best person to actually study that. And I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that, but you'll hear and see that in some instances. So if we were looking at the experience of, in the court system, of crime victims, if I myself had never been the victim of a crime, then I probably would not necessarily be the best person to actually study that phenomenon and those experiences of, in this case, crime victims. From a data collection perspective, again, the types of data collection involve observation, interview, and document analysis. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on those three. Two of those three you will actually have the experience of participating in. The third, I know that there is a lot of information in our textbook about document analysis, so again, we're not going to talk a whole lot about that because I do want to move on and look at this article. A couple other things, though, that I will say that you need to be thinking about is the data, not the data collection, but the data analysis. So we're going to kind of skip from just the bare essence of what is qualitative research to all the way down to actually what do you do with data once it is collected, because certainly from a quantitative perspective we're talking about using statistical techniques. Well, here there's no numbers, so your statistical techniques don't really help. So a couple of things I want to talk about are sensing themes or theming the data. The basic way that data is analyzed from a qualitative perspective is that it is coded and then themed. So each new piece of information, whether it comes from an interview, whether it comes from an observation, or whether it comes from a document analysis, each new piece of information that the researcher finds or discovers is coded and is separated. And then once similar types of information matches the information that you've already learned, then that is coded with a descriptor. So the researcher uses something called constant comparison. So as the researcher starts to analyze the data, they begin with a particular incident or particular phenomenon or particular piece of information, and then when they get more information, they compare the new information to the previous information. And if it's similar, then those two are put together. And then a third piece of information comes in. And let's say that the first two were very similar, and then the third is separate. So that starts some, and another, in this case, typically a researcher will use cards, like literally index cards, to code the data. and each piece of information is put on a new card. So in the data analysis, the first card is red and it has to do with something, and then the second card is red, and if it has to do with the first card, it's stacked on top of the first card. If it's a new piece of information, it's separated from the first card. And as the researcher goes through maybe hundreds or thousands of cards, they are placed on stacks, and those are continually themed and coded, and that's the nature of data analysis from a qualitative perspective. Another term that you probably should be somewhat familiar with is recursiveness. And what that actually means is that a researcher from a quantitative perspective would really not do anything with the data until all of the data was collected. And so if we're doing like a 6-week training, 3 days a week, an hour at a time, at the end of that 6 weeks is when the researcher would do anything at all with that data. From a qualitative perspective, once the data is starting to be gathered, the researcher can actually start coding and theming the data. And again, that is called recursiveness, where you're analyzing the data while you're still collecting it. A few other terms to be somewhat familiar with. One is triangulation. Triangulation means that if you go into let's say an organization and you're observing it, interviewing people, you are looking at documents, basically what you should see is that what you observe matches what you hear from interviews, matches what you see from reading and gleaning information from documents. So if you can think about triangulation or a triangle, there are 3 sides to it. So again, what you see should match what you hear, should match what you read. So you triangulate the data to ensure that there's good credibility of your data. A couple other terms, member checking. Member checking refers to the fact that after you have given, or if you've done interviews, you typically will type those interviews up and then give the transcript of the interview back to the person or people that you interviewed, and then you will let them check it, and just to make sure that what you have written is in fact what they actually said. So let's start looking at the article that you see on the screen, and what you'll see is that we see a number of the items that we just talked about relative to qualitative methodology. So again, on the surface, you wouldn't know that this is anything different than a quantitative research study. You see the title, you see the authors, you see the abstract, you see what I would say is a bit of an introduction. Notice again in your introduction you do have cited information, so you have information from research journal articles throughout. The author then states the problem of the study. In this instance, he starts talking pretty early on about the type of study that they're going to do. So let's keep going, and then they get into the theoretical framework or conceptual framework, also known as theoretical framework, and you'll see that they are in fact doing a case study. So they're doing a case study because that is the bounded system, if you will, that they are interested in examining. So again, more information. Again, I think if you can remember the upside down triangle, which I've mentioned before on several of these videos and will continue to mention, that's the way that you should actually write your review of a literature. So that upside down triangle. So start out very broad and then narrow your focus as you go through the in this case through the conceptual framework and or the introduction. So then the researcher gets down to the research questions. There's a couple of them. So again, very much like a quantitative research study. Then he starts talking, or they start talking about their research design. And let's see if I can find it here. But they do start talking about in here somewhere. They talk about this bounded system. Here we go, and they're going to look at in-depth data collection. because they're interested in this case in the effects of mentoring programs. Another term I'll point out is purposive sampling. Again, depending on whether you have actually read the chapter or not, that could be a new term to you. From a quantitative perspective, the general idea is that you should kind of get as many subjects as you can in your research. In qualitative research, though, you do use something called purposive study or purposive sampling because you want to interview, you want to observe, you want to talk to the people who can give you good information. So unlike random sampling where you get as many as you can, in qualitative research you get smaller numbers purposefully because they are the people who can help you answer your questions. So let's keep going. A couple other things let's point out here. Right here at the top of page 437, one of the things I'll point out is that they do give some information about the participants that's very similar to what you would see from a quantitative perspective, i.e. the first full sentence here, they do talk about what's required of the individuals to actually be in the study. So again, it's not loosey-goosey and whoever we can get, or it is very purposefully done. And again, these folks had to have been in the mentoring program 3 months, had supervised that person for a minimum of 3 months. So there was some criterion to be in the study. In the next paragraph, again, they're talking about methodology. 13 employees participated. And again, if you think about differentiating this from a quantitative research study, 13 employees from a quantitative perspective would be probably too small and be considered very much a limitation of the study. So again, just a difference between quantitative and qualitative research. The next sentence talks about how they actually went about collecting the data. So you can see that they did use some observations, they audio taped them, some focus groups, they reviewed documents. So they did all of the methodology that is even possible within the qualitative data collection possibilities. Lastly, in this paragraph, they talk about triangulating the data. So again, they looked at, did what they observed match what they heard, match what they read. And again, that's very important in terms of the credibility of the data. Again, here's our thick, rich descriptions. They did some member checking in order to make sure that what they recorded in their transcripts of interviews matched what the individuals had actually said. The next section deals with who they were really looking at, the actual organization that they were in. The second paragraph does give some numbers, and I've had students that was very bothersome to, but it's not uncommon that you'll see some descriptive information about participants in your study. The next little section talks about the limitations of the study, meaning the weaknesses of the study. And again, as a good researcher, one should always look for those weaknesses and be willing to actually talk about them in terms of the research process. There is no such thing as the perfect research study, so as a researcher you should be willing to critically analyze your research and point out potential problems with the research itself. The next thing is the results and findings. And again, notice in here that you don't see tables and descriptive information and t-tests and correlations and analysis of variances. You see information about theming and coding and description and categories. So again, I would say that to me a criticism of how this journal article is actually written is that they don't give you a lot of information about how they actually themed and coded the data. So some other articles will have much more information about that, but nevertheless, I think it is an interesting study. And then the last thing they do, or the next thing they do in the findings section, is they relate their findings back to their research questions. Then they do provide some conclusions and recommendations. So again, very much like a quantitative research study, they fit it back into the ADDIE model. And the last thing I wanted to show you is and talk about is the references. Again, one of the things that I am really interested in you guys understanding when you leave this class is that when we say research, we're talking about using peer-reviewed research journals as your references. And so a very quick glance down this reference list, and this isn't even the whole list, you'll see that you see journal articles, you see textbooks, you see dissertations, but one of the things that you don't see is any, none, if any, websites. And so one of the things that our students need to be much more diligent about is actually looking at research journal articles in creating these this reference list and this referenced information for your proposals.